History Month lecture at the University of Oxford. I'm Daphne Cunningham, co-chair with Alexander Gordon of the BME Staff Network. The network supports the BAME or BAME staff at the University of Oxford at all levels and is a critical friend to the university as it strives to become an inclusive and diverse institution and community. I would like to take a moment to invite our BAME staff here tonight to join the network by contacting me directly or looking for the BME Staff Network page on the university's Equality and Diversity Unit's website. The network supports this event annually by inviting speakers to talk to our Oxford community on subjects relevant to the BAME and wider communities. And this year, we are pleased to welcome an even wider audience for the lecture through this virtual platform. Tonight, we are taking questions for the Q&A section through the email account. So only this email account will be used. oxfordbhm2020@gmail.com. You will see the email repeated throughout the evening in the comments section below this video. Now, it is a pleasure to hand over to Dr. Mechelu Zimba, Policy Advisor for Race Equality within the Equality and Diversity Unit, who will introduce our next speaker and lay out the evening's program.
Yeah, good evening. I'm so pleased that so many of you could celebrate Black History Month with us tonight. So again, a warm welcome to all of you who are joining from across the country and across the world. We're so honored this year to have the university's Advocate for Equality and Diversity and Pro-Vice Chancellor, Dr. Rebecca Surrender, with us tonight. And she will introduce our guest speaker, Margaret Casely-Hayford. After the lecture, there'll be an opportunity for questions, as Daphne said, and so please do send those questions over. I'll now hand over to Dr. Surrender.
Good evening, everybody. I'm sorry, slightly clunky with all the things we have to press here. Hello, I'm Rebecca Surrender, as you've just heard, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all to the 2020 University of Oxford Black History Month lecture. I'm always delighted to be asked by the BME Staff Network to do this, and tonight I'm particularly excited to introduce our guest speaker, Margaret Casely-Hayford. Before I formally introduce Margaret, I'd like to make a few general remarks. This is the 33rd year that Black History Month has been celebrated in the UK. It's a time to acknowledge and celebrate the achievements, the history and heritage of African and African Caribbean people in this country, and an opportunity and time for people of all backgrounds to share in an exciting aspect of the UK's diverse and evolving cultures. It is also a time, of course, for the university itself to reflect on race equality. The university has held a Black History Month lecture every year since 2008, so this is our 14th lecture, and it's now a highlight of the academic calendar. But it is, of course, only one event in a wider range of activities and work which continues throughout the year as we strive towards fulfilling our commitment to improving the representation, the progression and the success of Black and minority ethnic staff and students in this university, and our commitment to creating an inclusive environment and culture for work and study. In that context, I'd like to thank the organisers of tonight's event, my colleagues in the university in the Equality and Diversity Unit, and in particular the BME Staff Network, not just for tonight's event, but for the amazing work they do across the institution and throughout the year. We really are very, very indebted to them. This year's lecture is particularly significant in the wake of the brutal murder of George Floyd in the US and the subsequent Black Lives Matter and other anti-racism protests across the globe. Despite the virus lockdown, Black Lives Matter protests have been held in cities across the UK, including in Oxford. As part of the anti-racism protests in June, over 1,000 demonstrators gathered outside Oriel College to demand the removal of the statue of Cecil Rhodes, and the Rhodes Must Fall in Oxford movement held a Freedom Summer 2020 series of conversations across Oxford. The recent protests have undoubtedly brought a renewed focus on the drive towards racial equality in our institution, and our staff and students are rightly asking that change happens at a faster pace. The message has been heard, is being heard, and at the start of this academic year, the VC announced a new race task force, which will take this forward. In addition to the work of the task force, we will be entering a period of intense review and consultation on all issues to do with race equality in the run-up to renewing our Race Equality Charter. It will be an important opportunity to interrogate and renew not just our goals, but also our resourcing and our methods of implementing concrete change. Please become involved in this process in the coming year. And if you'd like more information, please contact me directly or one of the Equality and Diversity leads in your division, or of course in the Equality and Diversity unit. So that leads me very neatly to introduce our speaker tonight, who I know will be well known to many of you. She will not allow us to become too self-congratulatory or complacent in our discussions here tonight, but will, as she always has, challenge us to better understand and confront the reality of racism in Britain. Margaret Casely-Hayford, CBE, is a British lawyer, businesswoman and public figure who is active in the public sector and will be, as I've said, well known to many of you. She was appointed to the chair of Shakespeare's Globe and Chancellor of Coventry University in 2018. Margaret has had a distinguished career in law as Director of Legal Services and Company Secretary for the John Lewis Partnership, following a 20-year career with a city law firm. Her portfolio includes advising young entrepreneurs and supporting and advising organisations on governance and advising those, in particular women or people coming from a BA. We in Oxford tend to use BME, BAME or LGBTQ background, people who wish to embark upon board careers. She is passionate about establishing diversity on boards and is an ambassador of Board Apprentice. She champions better governance and democratic processes, and this year was appointed to the Institute of Directors Governance Advisory Board and made a Fellow of the Institute of Public Impact. Margaret, thank you so much for making time to join us this evening, and we're delighted to have you as our 2020 lecture speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for that really warm welcome. And I'm particularly delighted to follow you, given that you have emphasised the fact that Oxford embarks upon welcoming, including, and promoting Black and minority ethnic inclusion and involvement all year round, because of course October is really busy for all of us, but we are relevant all of the year. We are Black, minority ethnic, 365 days a year. So I was really heartened to hear the emphasis on the whole year round activities, and long may that continue. So activism, it sort of runs in the DNA of my family, but I've decided this evening to talk about activism of the Black Lives Matter movement by analogy with a feminist activism, asking whether it's gone too far. And I did that because of the reactions that I've seen on Twitter and from people calling me woke and challenging that we're dealing with this in the wrong way. So let me start by saying a friend of mine summarized what happened on the 25th of May, 2020 in this way. Many of us watched in total horror as one man, possibly safe in the knowledge that the system was probably on his side or reckless as to the position because of the surrounding lack of accountability, placed his knee on the neck of another human being and imposed pressure for 8 minutes, 47 seconds. 8 long minutes and 47 seconds, during which he pressed the life out of the other man as the other begged for mercy, called for his life, cried out, "I can't breathe. Please, I can't breathe." And in those moments, when he realized his life was almost over, called out for his mother, his dead mother, and the world watched horrified as George Floyd died. And in spite of the fact that we're in the midst of a global pandemic, people took to the streets to demand change. And there were 260 protest marches in Britain alone. It certainly sparked a renewed activism. Through the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, the successor to similar movements that had responded to a horrifyingly similar incident in the 1990s, and I dare say many more prior to that. But in the 1990s, a young man by the name of Rodney King was shot and killed by police. And people at that time said, things must change. But I raised the question in the title of my talk, whether the activism of the Black Lives Matter movement had, by analogy with feminist activism, perhaps gone too far because of the counter-reactions that have grown up and the growth of populism that we're frequently being faced with. And in June, the number of racially or religious aggravated offences recorded by police across England and Wales was 1/3 higher than in June last year. The Home Office said that increases seen in June and July 2020 were likely to be directly related to the Black Lives Matter protests, and far-right groups counter-protests across the country following George Floyd's death. And overall, there were 105,090 hate crimes recorded, compared with 97,446 the year before. The majority of hate crimes were race-related, accounting for around 3/4 of those offences. By comparison, sexual orientation hate crimes recorded by the police in England and Wales also increased, but by a far lower percentage. So some of the increases in violent crimes could be purely down to lockdown issues, but the relationship of the spike in response to the Black Lives Matter protests is clear. Is the rearguard action an acknowledgement by those who feel themselves defeated that they're desperately trying to preserve a status quo? Are the spikes caused by a paranoia because the extreme right sees a growing awareness about police brutality and lack of accountability in the rest of society as an indicator that others see a need for greater equality? Whatever the reasons, you won't be surprised to know that my view is that until activism attains its objectives for change, it's probably not gone too far, perhaps not gone far enough, and at least a significant part of those ambitions ought to be achieved before people start to think in what I believe is a relatively complacent fashion. But I have to stress that activism takes the form, if activism takes the form of murder, and you will know why after the recent incident in France, I stress that it's my view it cannot be condoned. Neither would I condone it if it took the form of physical harm to others. Most tried and often repeated methods of activism are probably, though, significantly wrong anyway, even if the eternal optimism of the activists is laudable. But if I'm right, one should then ask whether it's possible to understand better what the flaws in the methodology are, which is so often engaged in, and how they might be bettered, and whether it's important to seek change through activism, even if its aims are not achieved. But these are massive questions to try to deal with in 20-25 minutes, and it's probably a ridiculous ambition. So please forgive me, this is going to be relatively high level. And I'll look at some only of the pertinent questions underlying the bigger question in the title. Questions such as, when is activism justified? How much has it changed in its form? Does it trigger helpful as well as adverse responses? How might it evoke better responses? And is it even appropriate to ask about the efficacy of activism? Now, if this was a regular Zoom call at this point, I would ask you all to put your hands up if you thought activism was justified, but because I can't see you, I'm going to have to imagine. And I would imagine that it would be a relatively split audience, particularly after the recent events in France. But I would say that activism is justified when democracy or other prevailing systems fail the minority, when the marginalized are shut down or ignored, and the processes through which those that gain power are asked to listen, and those processes are clearly no longer working in the way that compels them to honor their responsibilities. And I know that if Sophie Walker, the founding chair of the Women's Equality Party, were in on this conversation, she would undoubtedly say that people are claiming that your activism has gone too far, when they really mean that you're making them uncomfortable. And what does that mean? It means really that it's working. It means that the change that you seek is challenging their position being one that benefits from the retention of the status quo, which means that they don't have an awareness or an understanding of the pain, the poverty, or the lack of privilege of which you speak. But you're daring to call out that point, and to ask for an improvement of the position makes them feel discomfort. So you or the people you represent have to continue in pain or poverty or experiencing only limited rights, so they feel all right. Those who benefit don't want change, so they will tell you that you have enough equality. But what is enough equality? If the equation tells us that X equals equity, then we ought to balance the equation by adding X at the very least. How much has activism changed in its forms? Well, we're used to physical activism in the form of demonstrations, blowing up letterboxes, bombings, and self-immolation. And it's very apparent that these are veritable and terrible sticks rather than carrots. And one might say matchsticks in the way that they tend to be incendiary rather than persuasive, if the statistics that I referred to earlier are anything to go by. We're well used to these forms of protest, and they've taken place ever since the first holders of power and privilege failed to realize how much it was marginalizing or exploiting the rights of others. And there is also obviously now the more modern counterpart in the form of online activism, which clearly gives a voice to the voiceless, succeeds in community building, but can readily be criticized for leading to the establishment of pretty pointless echo chambers. So how effective is any of this? We still remember over 100 years later, Emily Davis's heroic act of hurling herself in front of the King's horse at Epsom in June 1913, which is thought by some to have been pivotal in the point at which the tide turned and the opinion of the masses changed in favor of recognizing the need for female enfranchisement. But let's explore that later. Because once you've killed yourself, if those in power still don't listen, what can the movement behind you do then? Consider the fact that there were Tibetan monks who self-immolated in protest against the treatment of Buddhists by Catholics in South Vietnam at the time of the Vietnam War. The world was shocked into noticing their plight, but I fear that the same situation for many Uyghurs in China is not going to be ended by the numbers who've burned themselves, because the shock of immolation might have been lost since the 1960s, or because state management of media neutralizes their message. And then closer to home, Irina Slavina, the founder of a popular Brave News website, Koza Press, which investigated and publicized state and corporate wrongs, on October the 2nd, went to the Interior Ministry at Nizhny Novgorod in Russia and sat on a bench between two bronze figures, which, it's worth noting, are a monument to Russian law enforcement through the ages. And she set fire to herself, an act of incredible self-sacrifice. And it should be the ultimate in terms of a rallying cry. She clearly intended her death, because there's a video showing her actively pushing a bystander away who tried to intervene. And her last post says, "For my death, I ask you to blame the Russian Federation. I keep writing about all this injustice, but nothing is changing." Her friend and fellow activist, Maria Popova, said she didn't want to die tragically, she wanted change. But one journalist who reported on her memorial recently said, in a city with a population of more than 1 million and a country of more than 140 million, the turnout a few hundred is but a drop in the ocean. So can it be said that you've gone too far if your ultimate sacrifice doesn't cause change or barely gets noticed? Is it that you've not gone far enough? What was the difference between what Emily Davison achieved and what Irina Salvina failed to achieve? Immolation of Buddhist monks in Vietnam, Uyghurs in China. Clearly, given the decades between the Rodney King murder and the George Floyd murder, and the fact that nothing much appeared to have changed in the intervening period, even though parts of cities were burned in protest at Rodney King's death, suggests we need a really hard examination of what indeed effects seismic change. The modern and quieter counterpart, I've said, is online activism, which clearly gives a voice to the voiceless, and I've said builds communities, but arguably gains traction very much more quickly. But does it lead to fundamental change? It may be early days, but let's consider the viral spread of #MeToo and #BlackLivesMatter memes. This type of meme has been helpful in network building for women and carers, marginalized people who don't have much time to be able to live the sort of active Greenpeace warrior lifestyle. It creates crucibles for building up arguments and crowdsourcing evidence that can, in cases such as with Harvey Weinstein, be supportive of and helpful to victims in the establishment of a damning portfolio of evidence to support public prosecutions or private cases. But many of the women had to reveal much about themselves in order to make their case with sufficient strength. So there was sort of a breast bearing in order to enable the breast beating. The women against Weinstein demonstrated that online activism that can initiate and support a body of evidence to lead to success in court cases against an individual can also leave one vulnerable. And we have yet to see whether this actually leads to the systemic change that the film and theatre industries clearly need to usher in. So why is there a delay? One reason is that there is a long tail of male movie moguls or females, I dare say, in the business who are pretty male in their mores and their attitudes and what they will tolerate. And we all know the arguments. I put up with it, you just have to man up or woman up, it's just locker room talk and so on. And another reason is that the online chambers in which discussions take place are created by young, white, non-disabled males with no or little awareness of pain or poverty or of being disenfranchised. So they create algorithms that enable, facilitate and promote a certain type of conversation. At best, these can readily be criticized for leading to the establishment of the echo chambers that we all know and probably by now are beginning to despise. But at worst, they create an arena of hostility that drives out constructive engagement and that could lead to any effective solution. Indeed, arguably, women who have, after all, as Simone de Beauvoir says in her wonderful book, The Second Sex, always been considered as other and therefore marginalized because men are the default, after all, have had to form groups within communities to give ourselves strength to be heard at all. So women need to find forums in which we can gather together for mutual benefit, to find solutions, even for everyday issues such as dealing with caring responsibilities, and indeed a wholly different set of algorithms compiled by people who understand is clearly necessary. And I don't need to illustrate the difficulties that other marginalized groups face through algorithmic prejudice, as this has been discussed elsewhere in great detail, and it's pretty key that we remember, and some people joke about the fact that Google driverless cars couldn't spot Black people, but the dangers could be mortal. And recently, up until recently, if you Googled white youth, you got images of people playing sport, sitting in cafes or picnicking. If you Googled Black youth, you got predominantly mugshots of people corralled by police arrests. So it's imperative to ask whether activism can work in any way effectively against a rigid system. And those who are aware of Sean King will know that his Black Lives Matter memes and activism have raised millions of dollars to fund prosecutions of officers implicated in fatal violence against unarmed civilians. And as a consequence of his fundraising success, he was able to resurrect a newspaper titled North Star that had been founded in the 19th century by the Black activist journalist Frederick Douglass, through which King now organizes appeals to what has become a huge network of online activists worldwide. So clearly growing your own brand, or in the case of his case, resurrecting one that someone had made earlier, has become a real part of the methodology to arm your essential community. But we've seen that in the case of Breonna Taylor and countless other victims of armed police in America, where those victims were people of color, that the subsequent coordinated blended response of marches with online activism hasn't yet led to significant degrees of success. Because even with all the money raised, the petitions signed, the marches and the calls for defunding of the police, the grassroots law movement initiated and supported by Shaun King and his North Star activists, no charges were brought against the killers of Breonna Taylor. And only one of the officers involved in the George Floyd killing is facing charges. In fact, I hear today that he's actually been charged successfully, but with the lesser charges. But he was up until today out on bail. So there is, although far from seismic change, we are seeing some movement. It's likely that the police officers involved in the murders of King, Taylor, Floyd, and so on, instinctively felt that they could rely on the response from the system to protect them or not to punish them overly harshly. But cases against individuals who were previously protected by the system are gradually increasing in number. And in a way, any shift in the number of that type of prosecution begins to suggest a change of attitude within the system. A step forward from the days when 14-year-old Emmett Till was lynched on the perjury of a woman who claimed that he had looked at her inappropriately, and no one was brought to justice, even after she had confessed to having lied. But let's not get too excited. There was a 60-year hiatus between then and now, and it might just be another 60 years before the next significant step is taken. But what's changing positively in activists' methods? Some discernible differences are that there is now increasingly an identifiable leadership in activist movements through spokespeople like Shaun King, as I've mentioned, and Emma Gonzalez and David Hogg, the two amazing school students who took on the National Rifle Association again in America, when they found themselves and their fellow school students victims of yet another gun massacre. They decided to lead the March for Their Lives movement, and one gets the feeling that these fearless young people would be prepared to be the Nelson Mandelas of their generation. They also worked with systemized action and an ordered framework of activity. So I would ask, is there any point in activism without such and without specific asks? And Greta Thunberg appears to know that there isn't. She makes her asks very specific. Whereas let's compare here Extinction Rebellion, who seem to be pretty much disorganized is probably the politest way I can put it, and seem not to have discerned their asks. So for example, they foolishly prevented the movement of mass transit vehicles like trains and underground tube trains during the rush hour, which actually meant that the vehicles that create lesser carbon emissions were prevented from moving. It's clearly mixed messages. Through their leadership, Emma Gonzalez and David Hogg have significantly reduced the amount of corporate funding of the NRA. Shaun King has managed to get prosecutions mounted. So is having a high-profile leader and a framework enough? Let's think about the suffragettes and the suffragists. The former would have been nothing without the pamphleting and political lobbying from within of the latter, albeit I'm ready to concede that hurling yourself in front of a galloping horse certainly grabs attention as well as headlines. But we also know, with the benefit of hindsight, that it was the role of women in World War I that really created the shift. It was when those in government recognized the benefit of having women involved in the workforce, and women therefore were better able to structure their case for gaining the vote. And this points very clearly to the profoundly important element that activists need to remember. Let's think about, for example, the Vietnam War that was protested against in huge numbers of ways, but it wasn't until the US government had it pointed out to them that there was a direct benefit when the American middle classes started to experience a loss of their sons in the war, and the National Guard was faced with having to quash middle-class activists at home, the government began to think about possible vote loss and the consequences of continuing the war. So it's not just leadership, it's not just framework, it's also the demands and demonstrating to those that hold the power that there is a benefit from the positive response to your asks that emerge as key ingredients. Now, again, if I could see you all, I would ask you to put your hands up again at this point, because I would ask you whether you know the name of Alicia Garza. And I would surmise that the vast majority of those listening don't know her name, even though she is a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement. That's deliberate on her part, because she professes that people are not interested in her face, they're interested in the change. So she has deliberately kept herself invisible as a leader of the movement. But it's interesting because it didn't take off as fast under her leadership. And she does recognize that difference. She actually says 4 years ago, nobody talked explicitly about Black Lives Matter during the Democratic National Convention, but you couldn't get through 5 minutes of this year's without the movement being name-checked. What's more, it's being talked about with more substance than before. Previously, there were relatively symbolic issues like mandating the police to wear body cams, requiring implicit bias training, setting up police reform task forces that were discussed. Now it's focusing on defunding and restructuring the security services and whether policing actually keeps people safe. Huge, huge change. And these conversations are relevant globally and are happening globally. But to Alicia's point, I would suggest that if you're going to win people round with a well-structured framework, quite apart from the fact that I would advocate visibility and clear asks, I would also say, be careful about inadvertently setting up linguistic barriers. You've probably already lost their love if in trying to encourage people to embrace anti-racism over non-racism, you point out that non-racism in passively preserving things as they are is closet racism, when in their mind, the term racist is taken as an accusation of membership of English Defence League or the Ku Klux Klan. Similarly, defunding, decolonizing suggests removal of any positive framework in favour of deconstruction and mayhem, and a strong likelihood of chaos and at the very least uncertainty. And one could think of some really positive alternatives, like widening the curriculum and making visible a greater expanse of historic truth. So it's all in the negotiation. So that's another key point, your negotiating tactics. But I do think that activists tend to put their negotiating tactics too fully on the table and lay them bare. And I do think that that does allow them to be completely countered. And a really good example of that was the weekend when Mary Jo Laub trumped president in the United States. And I think, again, you might remember this. She made a TikTok video encouraging people to book tickets to his rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And she then told them not to attend. And her video went viral. And it seemed that 1 million people were due to attend because they'd booked. And actually, the Trump campaign got very excited about that. And between 12 and 20,000 actually arrived, depending on which news bulletins you look at. And then all the TikTok teenagers and the Korean pop music fans who support TikTok sort of did the equivalent of an online victory lap. And suddenly TikTok became a focus of attention, and the well-publicized use of TikTok heralded a backlash from the president, who under the guise of state security has striven to clamp down on it ever since. And he actually responded very forcefully by giving Microsoft an ultimatum of having to acquire the TikTok enterprise within a specified time, or TikTok would actually just be banned. And so Ms. Laup, who was then actually being courted by Joe Biden's grassroots campaign, basically had an important part of her army closed down, because clearly she'd been making those in power feel uncomfortable. But in a way, that sort of takes us back to where we started, because if activism does make those in power feel uncomfortable, I ask again, is it because it's working and because of the fear that the imminent change is heralded? But clearly the ingredients are there. We're beginning to see them: high profile, strong leadership, framework, demands that show how those that hold the power will benefit from a positive response to the asks being met, but also, I would add, the right type of language, careful with your negotiating tactics, and the tenacity to hold firm when it looks as though you're making those in power feel uncomfortable. La lucha continua. The struggle continues. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for that. Well, now, yeah, I'm sure like many others who were listening, you've given us a lot of wisdom and food for thought. We've received quite a number of questions. And just to say again, if you'd like to send a question, please do email us at oxfordbhm2020@gmail.com. Just to start, I think I'm going to take you back to your time here as a student at Oxford. So could you comment on the landscape of Oxford during your time here in terms of women's activism and anti-racism?
Yes, certainly. It was a very different time. Late 70s, early 80s, Margaret Thatcher as premier. It was great having a woman as leader, but she was very much the sort of woman who told women that there was no hindrance. And being very much feminist, I did very deliberately chosen Somerville, because Somerville was set up by women who recognized the difficulties. So it was set up to enable women to be able to come to Oxford and to be able to graduate at a time when these opportunities were not available to women. Obviously, things changed over the century, and by the time I was there, during the economic Big Bang, when there was an awful lot more in terms of money and opportunity, women were basically saying, we have to do it for ourselves. Let's now stop asking for permission. Let's just go out there and do it. And there was a very strong feeling within Somerville that we created our own space. We created our own opportunities. And it was a great time. But I think that one of the things that happens is that unless there is structured change, when times get rough, there's a sort of recoiling in terms of, society goes back to its conventions. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens now when we're in an economic downturn. And as I've understood, again, from the Women's Equality Party, the people who are being made redundant first are women. I would imagine that also, if there were the statistics, and this is a damning indictment in itself, there are no statistics to find out whether the Black and minority ethnic people are also being made redundant in larger numbers. But we should watch out for that, because of course that the corollary is that those are the people who are probably going to be employed last when the upturn comes around. So we need to start to address these. We need, and I have to say that, albeit that I think that we've moved on considerably, and there is a good reason for Somerville having become co-ed. There's still a lot to do. But as I said earlier, I was really delighted to hear some of the points that, in particular, the reference to the task force that Dr. Surrender made earlier on in her introduction.
Yes, yes. Yeah, there is some movement on that front here at the university. So we have quite a number of questions, some around similar topics. So I'll just throw out one. So what is your view on teaching white privilege as an uncontested fact? Is it illegal? The Women and Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, told the Commons debate on Black History Month that schools must offer opposing views. But this seems to be banning freedom of learning, which will affect which will affect activism. So do you have any thoughts you'd like to share on that?
Yes, I mean, in my talk, I talked about decolonizing being a frightening term. And I think that that white privilege is also a frightening term to some people. But so I think perhaps we need to find other ways of making people understand the reality of it. And it goes back to the point that I made about seeing the whole truth, because there has to be an understanding that if for 400 years you have had the default position, that does mean that you don't wake up in the morning and start to worry in the way that others might worry about whether they have to comply with a certain invisible set of standards before they've even begun on the task in hand. That is a position of privilege. Whether you're rich or you're poor is not relevant. It's a question of whether you start out having to worry. I mean, I'll just give a really frivolous example. Because of the time at which I was born, there is no way I would ever have gone into the law with natural hair. It sounds trivial, but I have straightened my hair so that I would conform to a certain norm because I didn't want to frighten people when I walked in for an interview. The fact that I have to think about that, and in fact, in the days when I first started getting my hair straightened, it was with really crude chemicals that caused your head to bleed. So, I'm having to go through that sort of nonsense on a regular basis. So tell me that white privilege doesn't exist. I'm sorry, but it's a fact. And I would love to have a cup of coffee, it would take longer than that, probably a 3-course dinner with Kemi Badenoch, because I listened to her speech with my mouth open. I was astonished. It was a sad and naive speech, and it denied basic facts, because what we're not saying is tell the children that there is any one class or cohort or race of people that is superior. What we're saying is recognize that if you are born with certain characteristics, the world is easier in certain respects. It's just fact. And it's very easy to demonstrate. For example, Chichi Nwanoku, the completely wonderful human being who began Chineke Orchestra, which is the only orchestra in this country, or the first orchestra in this country, certainly, to have preponderantly a diverse range of people. She said that it's been proven that if you have blind auditions, so in other words, if the people auditioning to get in the orchestra are behind a screen, as many Black or people of color come through as white. The moment the screen goes, oh, what a surprise! People suddenly find that the tables are turned back, and people go back to thinking, oh, I think so and so is the better player, which is absolutely fascinating, and it says so much about the fact that we're just pre-programmed. And I've walked into a room as a lawyer with an assistant who was white. And of course, the people that we went in to meet assumed I was the assistant. Mm-hmm. It's to do with the fact that we're pre-programmed. And so the fact that I then have to work harder to demonstrate that I can do this and I know what I'm talking about, is what I mean by the privilege is a fact. There are so many different ways that it can be demonstrated. Kemi Badnock, come and have a cup of tea with me, please.
We have a really interesting follow-up question to this whole discussion, and that is, do you think that Kemi has torpedoed the support of allies to the wider Black Lives Matter movement through her actions or through her through what she said?
I think that she probably hasn't single-handedly torpedoed it, no, but what I would say is that she gives people the ability to feel comfortable, more comfortable, because in a way, it goes back to the point I made about the discomfort. Nobody wants to feel uncomfortable. And what she's doing is she's helping them to think, okay, it's not as bad as we thought it was because this Black person here says it's not. And that's not necessarily a torpedo, but well, perhaps it's certainly not an exocet, but it's a tiny shell. It's damaging, but it's certainly not fatal. I think that what is very difficult is that a number of the people that she's placating are the people who think that we have a victim and persecution complex. And it's very difficult to get around that sort of argument if there are people saying, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. The one example that demonstrates you can buck the system doesn't tell you that there is systemic opportunity. It just tells you that there is one example that bucked the system. That's all it does.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Just moving on to the types of activism. I mean, you shared quite a bit with us on different strategies. And one question that's come through is based on the killing in France the beheading in France of a teacher. And so the question is, do you think this is some form of activism, and what cause was it defending?
Well, as I said in my talk, I really don't condone the harming of another human being, let alone the killing of another human being in the name of activism, and certainly not in the name of religion. I mean, the idea of thinking that you can proselytize, win people round by slaying some of their family is utterly bizarre and totally abhorrent. But what I do think is that every religion can be manipulated and twisted and weaponized by extremists. And the problem with the extremists is that they then tarnish the brand, and they tarnish the brand so profoundly from the perspective of others that it gives the others a really easy target. That's one point. But the other point is that we do tend to look at things very differently when we're hard up against them. And in years to come, I think we will look differently at the way in which Muslims are treated. When you think about the way that Catholics were treated in this country, and the fact that it would now be considered really utterly bizarre to treat Catholics as different, and to prevent them from their religious worship, to vilify them in the way that some members of the press would actually expect the Islamic culture to be treated if they had their way. I think our problem is we're too hard up against the issues currently, and with hindsight, we'll look at things differently. But we do have to be really, really careful not to do what the Americans did when the top news headline was O.J. Simpson's case, when he was charged with having murdered his wife, and one couldn't go to a dinner party without somebody asking you about what this did for Black people. as O.J. Simpson a bad role model. No, O.J. Simpson was a guy who was charged with murder, just like any white guy who was charged with murder. I mean, it really is extraordinary. Dr. Crippen is not seen as a bad role model for doctors. He's not seen as a bad role model even for doctors, let alone all of white people. There are so many mass murderers who are white, who nobody ever asks us those questions. So by the same token, I would say, if one lunatic chops off the head of an innocent teacher, that lunatic is not the whole of the Islamic religion. And we really have got to be careful to understand that.
Mm-hmm. Well, just almost maintaining this international conversation or dialogue. The next question we have takes us back to the US. And this asks, the question is, could you share any reflections on what is happening in the US, particularly concerning the conservative Black community and individuals like Candace Owens, who is a conservative woman of color and who has publicly supported Donald Trump and is known for her criticism of Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Party. So what parallels are we able to draw between the UK and the US in the use of Black conservatives to attract both white and Black voters?
So it's an interesting question, because I follow Candace Owens and also Dominic Samuels, who is British and has very similar views to Candace Owens, because I'm so mesmerized by their position. I think that it's very useful to have people who speak out with that voice, because what it does is it says that we're not all the same, that there's the rainbow of views, rainbow of perspectives, and that we all deserve to be listened to. And even though it would be really helpful to be able to speak with Dominique Samuels and understand her better when she is decrying the Black, actually no, in fairness, she doesn't decry the Black Lives Matter movement, but certainly Candace Owens does. I wouldn't want them to be closed down by any stretch of the imagination. I think that it's unfortunate that they can be used as poster people, but in a way, it is what democracy is all about. It is about hearing and listening and challenging and trying to make sure that you are winning people over. And it goes back to the point that I made earlier on, that you don't win people over by just putting up linguistic barriers. And if we are not managing to get the Candace Owens of this world to understand why the Black Lives Matter movement is so important, then we're perhaps not using the right language, or we're not working hard enough, or we need to find other methods. So she has her uses for that reason. But I find her fascinating because she actually attends rallies of people that I imagine would actually like to see her incarcerated at the very least, and probably worse, with complete equanimity. I mean, she's an astonishing woman. There are some who say that she has a self-hate, but I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah. Well, going back to different strategies for activism, there has been an increasing awareness of the need to have more women and people of color on the boards of organizations. So from your experience on such boards, could you share some of the ways in which this increased representation contributes to the broader struggle for equality?
Well, first of all, where boards are engaged, it's the best way to introduce systemic change within an organization, because it means that you can actually get approval of policy, get a structure that recognizes where the gaps are, seeks to establish the data to enable you to monitor improvement, looks on a regular basis and expects reporting on a regular basis about improvement, organizes reward on the basis of improvement as well. And that almost treats failure in this area like another risk that the board has to deal with, which is absolutely the right thing to do. You know, we've only got to think about what happened with Joe Malone and John Boyega to recognise that if the organisation isn't looking at this properly, isn't asking itself the right questions, they can leave themselves open to such massive risk that they damage the asset value. And if there's anyone who's listening who doesn't know that John Boyega was asked to be the brand ambassador globally for Joe Malone, and he was thrilled, and he made a beautiful, incredibly moving film. And then when Joe Malone, the company, wanted to promote the film in China, they had it completely remade with no black people in it whatsoever. And given that it was his personal story, and he hadn't been told that they were going to do this, John Boyega was really annoyed about it. So annoyed that he actually said, actually, you know what, keep it. I'm not going to be your brand ambassador any longer. I find this really actually quite rude. And he stepped away from it. And what was so interesting was that the founder of the original brand who'd sold to Estee Lauder, Jo Malone herself, was supportive of John Boyega's stance. So the asset value in the brand, it was really tarnished. It's plummeted as a consequence of that. So it's a real risk that needs proper risk management to make sure that you're listening properly to people, treating them with dignity and respect, giving them the opportunity to appeal against wrongdoing, and all of that. If the board's properly engaged, all of those things should be things that the board will be hoping to see in place and monitoring as part of what a good board does. It's great to see statistics about women on boards. There aren't enough statistics about ethnic minorities, in particular Black people on boards. And I know that many boards are now making a positive point of trying to gather that information. And even then, I mean, because we start from a position of a lack of trust very often, there's a question of having to persuade us that it's right to submit the information, which tells you an awful lot about, well, that's an illustration of lack of privilege, if ever, isn't it? If you can't trust the organisation, you're frightened about what they're going to do with the information. It tells you quite a bit. So yeah, there we have it.
Yes, no, indeed. It is quite a struggle for organizations to be able to portray that they are trustworthy enough for minority ethnic people or people of color to feel free to disclose who they are for purposes like that. So from some of your wide experience in the corporate sector and in law, and also in higher education now, what advice would you give us as a university in our aspiration to become more anti-racist?
Organisations that I'm linked with, I'm very proud to say, have, first of all, just made a statement, a public statement, a manifesto, whatever you like to call it, which says, this is where we are now. And the importance of that statement, this is where we are now, is it's a recognition that something's wrong, or that this is as far as we've got, because there is no organisation that's in a really spankingly brilliant position with regard to being anti-racist. And so what they're doing is they're saying, we recognise the gaps in what we've achieved so far, or we haven't achieved anything as yet. This is who we are, but we are going to change. And then having made that manifesto so public, you can then be held accountable against it, which I think is really important. It's a really brave thing to do. And then you then set about with key objectives of drafting a policy. And as I say, looking at your existing data, and then analysing the data to tell you the story of where you are, where the gaps are. And then also then saying to yourself, so what do we need to do to be anti-racist? What are the activities that we need to take on? Because it isn't just allowing the status quo. And it's such an active set requirements. And there's an awful lot out there now. And what's really good about organizations saying we will be anti-racist is that it's such a huge recognition of not leaving it to the person of color in the organization to deal with, as if it's just their problem. And in fact, I was talking to an organization recently that, it's quite a big chain that wants to get to good. And they were asking about this, and they were telling me what sort of networks they'd set up for people to speak amongst themselves and to establish better diversity and inclusion. And I said to them, but you can't leave little groups of people just talking to themselves. And you also can't just bring in a person of color and say, you deal with it, because it's a little bit like the infrastructure behind the building of a house that floods. You'll have the local authority that grants the consent for the house. You have the developer that builds the house. You have the builders that build, the architect that designed, the fire chief and the fire resourcing people who come and help when the flood has occurred, etc., etc. So saying to the householder, you sort it, is your problem, can't be right if there is a whole ecosystem of people involved before the house has flooded and in its and resolving the issue. The most the householder can say is, oh, it came through the drains, the water came up through the drains, or so they can tell you a little bit about how it impacted on them. They cannot resolve the whole problem. And importantly, if it can be avoided at the beginning, so in other words, if you are the local authority, the architect, the house builder, you have the ability to create a structure that works for the householder. Mm-hmm. So, that's why I just say to them, just bringing in one brown or black individual and saying sort it is just a waste of time. It's unfair, and that you're leaving them in a situation in which they're doomed to fail. There's so much more that can be done in being anti-racist, and that's the great thing, the difference between anti-racism and non-racism.
So speaking more to young people in the UK today, what part do you feel activism plays with young Black and minority ethnic youth in the UK? And so this individual says that, by that I mean, how do you feel it could influence them positively? As sometimes I feel it can be misinterpreted.
But I'm going to throw the question back. Isn't it only misinterpreted by people who don't want to feel uncomfortable? And if that's the case, on the basis of what I've said already, pretty much to hell with it. We've got so far now that because 400 years after slavery was abolished, and there are still systems that say those people need to be down there. And in this country, it's not quite as bad, but it's sort of invisible. It's sort of an understanding that we're slightly lesser, and people are still surprised if there are Black professors and Black surgeons and Black consultants, and it's just not good enough. We can do anything. So until people are comfortable with the fact that we can do anything, let's just continue trying to get them to listen. And if it makes them feel uncomfortable, well, hey, the sadness of Ms. Salvino that I mentioned was that she'd been talking and talking and talking, and she got to the point where she hadn't managed to make people feel sufficiently discomforted that they listened. So she burnt herself alive. We don't want to get to that.
Yeah. So, an interesting follow-up on that particular point you made is a question that came in to say, surely it's too early to say whether Salvina's death was in vain. It took another 6 years after Emily Davison's death for women to get the vote. So that was a comment.
I think that is a fair point, and I completely put my hands up to that. And even when I was writing the essay, I was thinking, it may be too soon. Yeah, I think that, no, that is fair. What I would say though is, I think that the reason that I refer to the journalist who said only a few hundred people turned up to her memorial by comparison to the numbers of people who lived in the city, is that if you think back to Jan Palach, who was a young Czech boy who did exactly the same thing in the 1960s, and protesting against the Soviet Union and its incursion into Czechoslovakia, the world was horrified, and the world reacted really profoundly. And I think that part of the problem is, it goes back to the distinction I made between the Uyghurs and the Tibetan monks. People sort of go, yeah, okay, we've seen that. And that is the problem. I don't know that Irina Salvina will have as much of an impact as Jan Palach had, just because through the passage of time, we've got slightly inured. And then also there's that point that I made about the Uyghurs, that also you have state-managed media responses that manage to just change the dialogue. And then, you have the ultimate in state-managed responses where Trump just clamped down on TikTok. So yes, let's wait and see. Let's wait and see what happens. But I'd be surprised if she managed to make as much of an impact as Emily Davison did. But it's a good question. It's a fair question.
We've had two questions come in that are similar and from women of color, or women who would say perhaps that they are Black women. And the question is, what advice would you give Black people in the corporate world actively promoting race equality and doing this without fear of non-explicit reprisals that could affect their career progression?
Yeah, great question. One of the things that I say to corporates again is that if you can't see that it's relevant to you, don't do it. And so what you have to do is to think about the business relevance. So if you can understand the business relevance, in other words, that you can, if you are making people feel comfortable within the environment, your workplace environment, they will do better for you. They will work without fear. They will therefore use all of their judgment rather than be constrained. That's better for your business. If you have better representation, you're likely to get a wider clientele. There's that fantastic story about Beyonce having a meeting with one of the sports brands. I think it was Adidas. And she walked into the meeting room and she sat down and they had this brilliant presentation and she sat smiling. And then she said, "Is this the team that's going to be looking after me?" And they said, "Yes, it is." And she just got up, took her coat and walked out. And when her team said to her, "What happened there?" she said, "Well, none of those guys look like me. I don't want to be with them. They're not going to understand me." And that's an important point. And if you don't realize the relevance to your business of making the Black and brown people who work for you feel comfortable, bring their whole self to work, do their best for you, you may actually be losing some really useful new clients, new suppliers, and so on. So try and understand the relevance to your business and make it an important part of your management's understanding about how the business would benefit from the change and from making people feel welcome. And there are lots of R's. It's at the point of recruitment, retention, reward, reporting, and then of course there is this relevance. So all of those, every company should be saying to itself, how do we make people feel in all of these stages? What are we doing? And if you express it in those sorts of ways, it goes back to the point that I made. Tell those in power what the benefit is for them. We're all selfish people, basically. And if people don't see a benefit, they're just not interested. Marcus Rashford's demonstrated that. I mean, the awful thing is feeding children doesn't benefit the people whose children they're not. And I just think it's absolutely tragic that we can't see the ecosystem of children who are well fed, learning well, and therefore gaining qualifications, and therefore becoming an active part of society, and therefore being an active part of the economy, and therefore paying tax, and therefore the ecosystem benefits all of us. But I'm not saying that the decisions that are being made are deliberately to starve children by any stretch of the imagination, because what's being said, in fairness, is through the system of, you know, the social structure, children will get, you know, their parents will get money to be able to support them. That I don't know the ins and outs of it. I'm not sufficiently well versed in it, but I'm just saying that he, in framing his point, could perhaps have got people to see things slightly differently if that benefit element was more strongly emphasized. And I think it's what we all need to do. You just need to make sure that people recognize the benefit of having you there and people like you.
Are there some examples where that you could share with us from here in the UK, where people have framed their activism in such a way that it's led to change? I know you've discussed a few throughout your talk, but do any others come to mind?
Gosh, that's a tough one. Activism that's led to positive change, because I looked for examples, and that's I think without the longevity that the you know, 2 or 3 questions ago somebody asked about, that's quite a difficult one, because I think that that it's normally at a distance that you realize what created the change, and then you can see, you know, Nelson Mandela, which is, you know, that's the biggest shift, paradigm shift of my lifetime, because when I was a child I couldn't see that apartheid would ever change. How could it? And so, you know, the fact that the activism did actually gain traction, move to be a global movement, got foreign governments, sports people, entertainers, the world behind them, and gradually it moved from, you know, being the small caucus of ANC activists to a much wider debate, was something that really gave me such an feeling of, my goodness, anything can be achieved through having a leader and a framework and a structure and clear asks.
So we've touched on, you've touched on examples from the US, from Russia, from around the globe. The next question that came in was asking about whether or not you feel the challenges faced by Black people in the UK are the same or different to those in the US. And I think I'd probably extend that to across the globe, because you've just mentioned Nelson Mandela in South Africa as well. So are these challenges faced by Black people the same or different?
It's interesting. I think that they're surprisingly similar, because I think that they stem from the fact that history has been told from the perspective of the victors and from the perspective of those who won at a certain time. Because if you go back far enough, there were points at which we were the victors, and, you know, we had wonderful universities, like, you know, in Mali, and the trade was very much centered in sub-Saharan Africa, and this the fact is that it's at this point in time that the benefits of having built on free labor, and let's face it, if you are building your business and you don't have to pay the people who work for you, it isn't that hard to make it a successful business. So all these people who go, well, we're superior because you know, our people managed to do this and your people didn't. Sorry, it's not that big a thing. I'm not a business, you know, the world's best businesswoman. I could start a business tomorrow, and if I didn't pay my people, I could be rich within days. So to understand that we're coming from a situation in which people were deliberately subjugated for a long time because it was beneficial, and then you had security systems that said they can't move out of that position because it undermines our economy. Even when the slavery was abolished, the systems that were in place still kept that mental subjugation, and in fact actual subjugation in many circumstances. So that's one set of facts that impacts on us. Another set of facts that impacts on us is that with the growth of colonialism, there were again rules, regulations, writings about how you treat the native people to make sure that they don't destabilize what you're trying to achieve in the country. And again, all of that has created a dynamic that makes it really difficult for us to establish ourselves, really difficult for us to harness our own energy, our own power, our own resources. But worse than that, what it's done is it's given us a mental barrier to transcend in those people who think that they've done it themselves. The number of times I've had people say to me, well, you know, white people, I've come from a poor background and I'm self-made. And I think, well, you know, the idea of you being self-made against a hinterland of a structure that is supportive of you getting to where you are is what you're not seeing, is what you don't understand. And I think that it's really, really important for us not to forget how that changes the dynamic and also it creates not just a difficulty here, but it creates difficulties for the Black diaspora, even, you know, just elsewhere, because there's colorism as a consequence. The lighter you are, the closer you're seen to be to successful, and all the norms that you know we talked about earlier. So I think they're not dissimilar. I think the difficulties are not dissimilar, and this is why understanding the history is really important. Having visible truth. And really understanding what's really great about Generation Z is they want that truth. It's a fantastic generation because they won't be fobbed off. And it is for us to say, yeah, this is the real picture. Yes, Colston did X, Y, and Z, but he also did this. You know, yes, Sir Hans Sloane was a wonderful botanist, but his empire was built on slave labor, and so on. And you know, it's not denigrating, it's rounding off, because there is nobody that's 100% good, and it gives a rounded picture of the individual, and it's perfectly legitimate to give that rounded picture.
Yes. Oh, I think this global, how you've drawn in the global perspective, is perhaps the best time for us to call our questions to an end. Thank you so much for all of you who have sent in questions. And once again, Margaret, thank you so much for your reflections and for the wisdom that you've shared. I'm sure many of us will go back and continue to reflect on activism and you know, particular strategies that we might employ in our own roles. I'd just like to invite my colleague Daphne back onto the call to say goodbye to all of us.
Well, I hope you agree with me that was fire tonight that we have. Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you so much, Machilu. As a co-chair, the BME Staff Network here at the University of Oxford. On behalf of the network, I would like to conclude this evening's event with a vote of thanks. We are very grateful to Rebecca Surrender and the university's Equality and Diversity Unit for their continued support of this annual lecture. In addition, we express our deep appreciation to Machulu Zimba from the EDU for so ably moderating the Q&A. To Tom Wilkinson and the university's Campaign and Digital Communication Office for their logistical and technical support. To Alexander Gordon for the fluid handling of the questions that came in from all of you this evening. And to Stephen Tuck, the history faculty, and the race and resistant conveners for their support of this event. More importantly, of course, we are very grateful to Margaret Casely-Hayford for speaking to us this evening and for sharing her timely insights on race, feminism, activism, and as a certain Douglas Adams would say, and everything. Also, may I thank you, our audience, for participation and contributions this evening. You have been fantastic. Thank you. We have all been enriched by this exchange. Thank you and good evening.